Hello, Hotshot.
What's up?
Okay, I'm here with HotshotGG. I'm going to do one of my Grilled interviews with him. And so I always like to start early on in people's careers. And so when I looked into the CLG career and your career, the interesting thing was, right at the beginning of League of Legends' actual competitive era was when you guys kind of like peaked and were at your top, it seems like. This is when you were winning events and stuff, and when your team had like these all-star players, etc. When you think back to that period, obviously compared to now, it might look less serious, like less professional and all this sort of stuff. Was it the case that it was like, did it feel easy to get to the top then? Were you just playing for fun and you didn't have to like work at it into the same way as people do now?
Well, inherently people were less skilled back then just because there was no practice regimes. We were all just like solo queue players that, you know, just played solo queue, and we made like an all-star solo queue team. And from there, that was enough to kind of become the best in the world. And we worked as a team a bit, but it's nothing compared to what it is now. There's like 20 teams in gaming houses that just train 12 hours a day, and to compete, you have to be on that same level of practice regime.
Because, I mean, you must know that the general criticism that you read about HotshotGG goes like this. If you aggregate everyone's views, it sort of goes, okay, so when the game was less serious and you could just sort of play, and maybe you didn't have to be so in-depth with the team, like everyone could just play their lane, and to some degree it was fun still, even at the top level. Then Hotshot and CLG were on top. They were the best team. But then once things got seriouser and seriouser, and then Asians came along and put this mindset where they're just grinding every day, and it's work almost, then people think, you know, Hotshot doesn't have the work ethic to stick with that, or he can do it sometimes, but then he lacks motivation. Is there any merit to any of this? Do you see where people come from?
Yeah, so I don't think it's an issue about motivation or anything like that. So in the past, it was definitely easier than it is now to succeed. Right now, there's just so much more competition. People are so much better, and it's not the fact that that we haven't been practicing, or we don't try, or that I don't try specifically. It's just, you know, someday it's your day, and also it's just a bunch of unfortunate circumstances that kind of like lead us to, you know, not succeeding.
After the initial period where you're actually winning these tournaments, then you had this middle period. Like I usually think of it as like when M5 rolls up in Europe and they were on top. Around this period of time, people would probably still have put your team like maybe third or fourth, maybe fifth in the world. This sort of a realm. So you're like contending, but you weren't winning the tournaments. When you talk about this period of time, like how much of this do you think is the period where like the Asian teams come in? Like what was their influence on the teams in the West not doing as well, et cetera, et cetera?
So at that point, it wasn't really, everybody was still on the same level, you know. You can't win forever. Like no matter how good you are, like it's really hard to just win 100% of your games. League is just so dynamic that, and so like unresearched, I guess. Like there's so many different things you can do. It's really hard to win 100% of your games. So like it was expected that we'd finally fall off. And M5 is a great team, and you know. They just it was their time to shine, you know. And the Asian teams and Korean teams at that midpoint, they weren't really they weren't into practice, or they weren't into like strict practice schedules. They were kind of getting like their gaming houses going, but nothing was too serious. Like no Asian dominance has kind of like really developed that. You know, everybody was on the same level. WE won Guangzhou, and they weren't too ahead of the time or anything. They weren't on the level they are now. It's really when OGN first started that people really started to get into like the serious training, and to seriously compete and seriously approach this as like an esport like StarCraft.
Because the strange thing when I look at that period of time, like 2012 essentially, if we look over the whole of the year, it seems like your team kind of fell like in an unfortunate position between the two extremes. So, okay, you had like the Asian, this extreme changing of the guard type scenario. Then over in the West, you still had people like TSM who were still like, they were like the best among the NA teams, and they could beat everyone from NA, but then they were terrible versus these Asian teams, whereas because you'd been to Korea, you'd kind of seen like, okay, well, what we did in the past doesn't really work, like we're going to have to adapt and change. And so So you'd begun to change to some degree, but then it looked like in results you kind of fell between the two because you could keep up with the Asian teams, etc. But then you were losing to TSM at home. Like, how do you think of this period of time? Because it seemed a bit confused in general.
Yeah, like a lot of it came from the roster swap. So when we roster swapped Saint Vicious, that really hurt our team because I had to learn a whole new role, and it's very fortunate that I was able to play jungle in Korea, because had I not, like when we first got to Korea, we got stomped so hard, and I probably got stomped the most because I was in a completely new role. Actually, I think me and Boy, but actually Boy already played top, but top was kind of like a new play style in general when you came to Korea. Like they didn't play like normal top laners would. You know, they don't go for a 1v1. It's like this really. He had to learn how to 2v1 all the time, and the metagame just completely changed when we hit Korea. So it was just rough for me to learn a whole new role and then kind of like adapt to like the Korean meta at the same time, and like this increased practice regime. But I think when I hit World Finals, I was at the same like level as all the other junglers. I just didn't have a broad champion pool, so that's what really like I guess stagnated my play.
If we think about your play in top lane just before this era I was mentioning here, there was a period in time where people might have said Hotshot's the best top laner. They might have said Chauster's the best bottom laner, definitely in North America maybe, and Big Fat LP's the best mid laner. So you had this period where you had kind of these all-star players. In terms of your own position, when you think of where you ranked yourself, obviously people now are going to put you like way down the list. Like most people won't be having you in the top 5, they'll be filled with like Asian players, etc. Where do you like see yourself now, and how do you see like the trajectory? Like was it sharp? Was there a certain point where you realized like I'm not like this all-star top lane player now? Was there a realization of that?
So one of the things that I relied on in the past, and it's just kind of like my play style, and it's always been, is that I typically didn't go for 1v1 kills. I kind of thought that like going with Ignite is like overrated. TP is just like the TP has so many different, like so many options. It's such a dynamic spell that you can use in so many different ways that you could outplay your enemy. So I didn't really, even when I was like dominating people, I didn't really, I didn't kill my lane. Like I just took advantages here and there with teleport. If I got through mid game with the exact same CS as the other person, and I have teleport, they have Ignite, I have a huge advantage on them. And so I kind of like extenuated that like play style, and I just, even now when everybody was like running these kill laners, I was trying to fit my niche like how I used to, and I would run TP on certain champions. And right now, like people don't consider me like a really strong player, but to be honest, like I've learned to kind of like play in my style. To the point where I think that I'm a lot better than I get credit for. It's just I'm not as.
What do you think people aren't seeing there?
I'm just not a flashy player. Like if for instance, if I'm playing against like there's one game where I was playing against Vulcan or something, and Zuna was just like, God, you're so annoying. Like I can't do anything. Like this is retarded, and I got like no credit in that game. You know, like it's like. There's nothing that really stands out. You know, if I land a 5-man LT on Galio, it's not like, damn, like he landed a 5-man LT. The things that stands out the most for people is when you carry the game, when you're that force that just like wrecks people. You know, that's when people are like, yeah, this guy's good. But there's so much more to the game than just that. You know, like I'm not a player that loses frequently. I just go even, and I don't lose and I don't win. And in that sense, people can't give me credit, you know, like I can't get that much credit. So, so for instance, like MacNoon is an exceptional player. He'll win like 70% of his games, he'll lose 30% of games. It's easy to identify like, damn, this guy brings a lot to the team, he's a star player, that sort of thing. But if I win by like this much, or I have a better team fighting champion, I play the team fights better, it's not as apparent as, damn, he just smashed this guy in lane, you know what I mean?
Okay. Well, in terms of actually what you're talking about here, the interesting thing is, obviously, when we talk about a lot of your top laners who you'll be compared to, nearly all of them I can think of are players who like are either the star of their team, sometimes even like the shot caller of their team, so everything's based around them, or they're at the very least known to the opponents as like this is the focal point. Like, okay, we play Najin Sword, we better take care of Macnoon. We play SKT1, obviously Reaper's like the guy we're going to be looking at, and so they're geared for success from their team, but then also the opponent's geared to try and shut them down. So when you think from your perspective, describing how you're playing League of Legends now, is it the case that because in your team you have a different focal point, like you have a different goal in mind, different objectives in mind? Because what you're saying there that's interesting is when I hear people talk about certain positions like top lane, for example, people aren't using phrases like the good players. I mean, they aren't saying like, oh, well, I kill my opponent every time, or I always like try and stop him in this position. They're saying these vague terms like, oh, I apply lots of pressure, or I'm giving lots of resistance here. These aren't necessarily terms which are tangible, like you can count a score for them, but just the pressure can make the opponent do something different, obviously, and then he feels out of his comfort zone or something. So what are your like objectives within your team and like individually in this sense?
So relative to like other top laners, like if I'm playing against Macnoon or something, just the way I play and the team will think I play isn't really like, I'm not going to get dominated, and they're going to just leave me on an island with Macnoon, and I'm probably just going to go even with Macnoon. I'm not afraid of any top laners just because that's my play style. I'm not afraid of losing to any top laners. What I'm actually afraid of is doing less in the game than them, like in the late game, in the team fighting phase. So yeah, that's just something that's kind of been my thing. I just don't win, I don't lose. And like for the longest time, I felt that's what CLG needed. You know, like when we had Voibon on the team, he's a very inconsistent player. Sometimes he carries really hard, sometimes he fails really hard, and like that just didn't work with our team before because you know Doublelift and Chauster were kind of they were winning more than they were losing. Like they were just a very strong bottom lane, and now the times have kind of changed. I feel that Doublelift has kind of lost a lot of his carry power because of like balance changes for AD carries and also having a new lane partner. His dominance isn't there. So I guess like in that sense, like sometimes my team gets frustrated when I'm not the, you know, like the 70-30, you know, I'm just the 50-50 or like the 55-50, you know. It's I don't dominate. And like my team's kind of wanting that now, which is, it's putting me in this awkward position, but I'm trying to deal with it.
So the interesting thing actually that makes me think of is one thing that people often seem to forget to take into account, even pro players, because a lot of the pro players are very, very good at the game. They think to themselves, oh, I can just do whatever my team needs, like I can do whatever strategy we need to. And so they get sometimes caught in this trap where you might know what the perfect strategy or approach to stopping an enemy is, but if it doesn't match any of your strengths, it might be worthless to even try. It might be less likely to work than your strengths which aren't in vogue at the moment. So if we think of how the meta has changed over the last couple of years, the strange thing about your team is throughout your history, you could pick out different periods in time where you've had the best player, or at the very least the best in North America, at almost every position. I mean, even when Chauster was support, you could say because combined with Doublelift's bottom lane, they were the best bottom lane overall. So you had the best mid player early on, best top laner at some point in time, best jungler, questionable, but I guess maybe. You've even had Voidboy afterwards, who was also considered the best top lane. So you've had all these, the options were to go any direction almost at different points in time. So do you think some of the periods of not so good results have been a result of like picking the wrong direction to go, and like what the approach of our team is going to be at this point in time? Like, is this something you thought about?
Well, there's one thing you need to consider, right? When winning, it's not really about individual players as much as it is the team. Like, you can look at a team like Azubu Frost. Woong was extremely good top laner. He was like considered one of the best in the world. And then he swapped to AD and he was pathetic. Like, he was just bad. And he practiced with his team, and they were able to overcome so much to get second in the world finals. Like, that in itself just tells me that star players aren't as necessary as just overall teamwork, communication, synergy. That's just worth so much more. And I actually talked to like Frost a lot, and I always talked to people that were placing better than me, and I was like, how does your team like feel, and how does your team think? And one of the things that I was sitting down with Cloud Templar and stuff, he's like, everybody can have their off game, right? And so there's a point where Doublelift can be at 30%. And to have consistency and to win all the time, the best thing you can rely on is your team play, because that's something that can always be consistent if you work at it. Just your overall team dynamic, that sort of thing. And that's the way you succeed. You know, having a star player here, having a star player there, even if you have like Mac Noon in every lane, he goes like 80, and say the percentage was like 80% win chance. Eventually, you know, you're going to lose a game. The only way to stay extremely consistent is to play well as a team.
To ask a specific example then of sort of the topic I was getting into there, I mean, you mentioned there actually when Doublelift and Chauster had this amazing bottom lane, and we've even heard stories, like I heard an anecdote from, I think it was Froggen, who told me that when you guys first went to Korea, you guys were just like, I don't know if it was him, who said like basically the bottom lane was winning like 100% of the time, or something ludicrous like that, even versus these amazing teams. And so obviously that sounds great, like, oh great, we've got that sorted, but if your bottom lane's winning all the time and you're still losing the game, obviously there's something wrong with the approach, or you can say there's something wrong with the other players, but if we just talk about the general approach to having the bottom lane be the focal point, if you think of Season 2, was having a really, really strong bottom lane like one of the more successful approaches to the game? I mean, now if we look at some of the top teams, a lot of them have very, very good top laners. And we've even got this period now where people thought St. Vicious was being a bit of an idiot, where he said like, oh, carry junglers are going to be back. So obviously he wanted that to be the case, and it seems like it kind of to some degree is the case. So thinking how now we evaluate what the best positions are in terms of the most successful approach, what did you think of Season 2 for your team in that sense?
So AD carry was a lot stronger in Season 2 before all the balance changes, and jungler recently got buffed in my opinion in terms of like its carry potential. You know, you get a lot more gold overall, you can farm the jungle longer, so Saint's happy in that regard. But Season 2, junglers weren't ever the focal point really. It was actually based off the hero more so. Like if you give a TF a lot of lane pressure and presence and that sort of thing, he'll just carry the game outright. If you give an Evelyn lane pressure and, you know, get him snowballed, he'll just carry outright. It really wasn't about the position necessarily. It's about like the champion. The champion, you know, if you give a Rengar a little bit of momentum at the early game, the game's just won. Doublelift and Chauster were like this extreme circumstance that really didn't happen in any other team in the world that we played against. It's just, pardon me?
What makes you say that? What are you thinking of when you say that?
So Chauster and Doublelift won like 95% of the time. There was just this period where they just won and won and won and won and won. A lot of it was because I believe that their hero compositions and like what they practiced was one of the strongest at the time, and they were extremely good at it. So for instance, Tarek Urgot was just disgusting at that point, and Doublelift was the only like Urgot player that built like DPS, and Chauster was just like an amazing Tarek player. And so that synergy just really carried them, or not that synergy, just that practice with like that composition. And they had like 2 other compositions that they were really strong in that people didn't really spam as much, you know? People, when we played against CLGU, Crepa was spamming Leona. Like, we never played Leona. Like, it was really a clash of champion pools, and I think that not only were they really exceptional at the time, they had the correct, like, the best, in my opinion, 2v2 lanes all the time. So that's kind of why that dominance came about. Now everybody plays everything. Like, there's no AD carry that doesn't play a certain champion, so it's a little bit, that edge wore off. Yeah.
Okay, on the topic of like criticism your team gets or expectations, I notice in a lot of interviews particularly ones where you're doing it with people who know you, and so they know like you get annoyed by criticism or you get a lot of it. They kind of try to downplay it, like, oh, you know, people are they're being too scrutinizing, etc. But I have an interesting analogy I wanted to make for you. If you think of any like elite sports franchise, so someone like the Los Angeles Lakers or the New York Yankees, the thing with these sports franchises is, to the average man in the street, when he sees like a manager gets fired after one season because he doesn't win the whole title, he's like, oh, that's a bit unfair. You know, this manager was pretty good, and you know, compared to this guy in another franchise, he was doing quite well. But what this guy is not maybe thinking about is that these franchises have every single thing you need to win, except like an amazing manager or the team that works. So they can go, okay, what players do you need, right? We'll give you any of the players that you need. What living accommodations you need, we can give you anything you need. Essentially what they're saying is, we'll give you everything, but you have to win, because that's our expectation. That's what we can put on the table, so you have to deliver on your end, you know. And so when people expect CLG to either be the best NA team or to be one of the best teams in the world, I think there's like a degree to which that's kind of justified, because like I said before, if you go through the last, say, 2 years, year and a half, you've had like an all-star player at every position. You've had periods of time where you had like a certain lane was working really, really well. And so the expectation, it probably should be that you should be the best team in NA, or you should be one of the best in the world. I mean, am I wrong in this sense?
So one of the things that really frustrates me is that we were so close every time. Like, for instance, when we had a substitution and TSM was like the strongest in NA at one point, but when it came to B, every time we played against TSM, they'd win by like one match, or like Dignitas would beat us in the lower bracket, which would give TSM like another 2 games on us that we didn't have. And even if we managed to just, you know, go 50-50 with them, and they eventually win the tournament because of beating Dignitas or something, everybody's like, damn, you didn't win, like, you're worthless. Like, even if it was the closest last game, people don't consider you the winner, then like you didn't do well. And so that's what a lot of people tunnel on. We've always been so close to just making through the other point, but we just fell short every single time. And like people like look at the results and they see first, second, third, you know. But to me, it's like, how far were you ahead of everyone else? Were you first by a long shot? For instance, like WE at IPL 5, that was first by a long shot, in my opinion. But if you look at like some of the other games that we've played in the past, you know, it's been neck and neck. Like we were, when M5 first won their tournament, if you look back and you go back, we were winning the game by a significant margin, or we were winning the games by a significant margin, and it was a really close game. And I remember I threw one of them, and I got caught or whatever, but we were in the driver's position to win that game. Like it was down to the wire. Like they were on their last lifeline, and I threw it. And if you consider those things, you don't really see too much like of that discrepancy. We're not that far apart, you know. That's just how I feel, you know. Like obviously we didn't win, and that means a lot. But in terms of like overall like chance to win and like that sort of thing, it's really not that far apart. Well, it hasn't been.
Well, then is it fair to say that your team, maybe in the past at least, has had a problem with like closing the deal, like a problem with when it's like the crunch time period where we have a slight lead or you can't convert on it? Because it sounds like that's what you're saying, like you're in positions to win, but then you're not winning. So it's like a different problem to not being able to get in the position in the first place. I mean, what do you think this is the case? What do you put it down to, just thinking backwards to things you already know have happened? Yeah,
like I think CLG's biggest problem like has never been not having like this star player and not having this role succeed or crushing the lanes. Like all of that is just, it's never really solved any of our problems, never like won us games. I think what we struggle the most is team communication and just being able to, I guess, play correctly in the late game and that sort of thing. We really struggle with our team communication. And if you were to talk to our teammates now, and you talk to any of our teammates, that would be our #1 weakness. You know, like we go over this so much, and we just try to improve. And that's always been the case for the longest time, but we haven't been able to recognize it as well. You know, we've always thought that this was the problem, or this was the problem, or this was the problem, but it's always been the same thing, in my opinion, which is we don't communicate, or we just don't have that like late game finisher that we were supposed to.
Because this is a topic I actually wanted to bring up, which is the idea of having the shot caller, or the guy who's like, he doesn't have to be the guy who has the idea, but he's the guy who decides what we do with the idea. Because the key thing you notice is, especially a lot of the Asian teams, like I was thinking about the difference between the two cultures, and it's not just that these practice more and these don't. It's even their cultures are actually set up in these opposing ways. So in the West, we have this ideal of, oh, we're very democratic, every individual should have his say, and you know, even if you're the worst player, you should be able to have like some input as to how your role's played. Whereas in Asia, you see like, they have a very strict hierarchy in the society, and it goes even to the extent that every relationship is actually defined. Everyone knows at every time. Like even if you're like with your little brother, you know he has to treat you in a certain way because he's your little brother. It's so strict, so everyone knows at all times who is sort of like in the authority position. And so you see it in their teams, like even if some of them can give input during a game, there's one guy who makes the final decision and he says, no, we do this now. And then everyone just goes, okay, we do that, even if they were thinking, oh, I wish we'd do this instead. And so if we look at your team instead, I mean, your team is one of the ones where when I've read and I've listened to people, it sounds like one of the most famous examples of a team that like, 3 people are throwing out different ideas, like, oh, we could do this, we could do this. One of them might be the right answer, but just trying to sort that out between 5 of you and agree on what to do, that could be like 10 seconds lost, it could be like a key moment lost. What do you think of this?
So that's actually exactly it. When in the past, we've never been actually able to, you know, choose a shot caller. And also, since we were like, it's been so long that we've been playing this way, which I believe to be the incorrect way. I think 5 minds working as one is better than 5 minds working on their own. It's so hard in a team game to play like that. And so we've been playing like 5 minds working on their own for such a long time that it was really hard to transition. First, we had to figure out the shot caller, and when Saint was on the team, he wanted to be the shot caller, and then Chauster, we wanted Chauster to be the shot caller, but Chauster wasn't really stepping up to the plate, and so we made Saint shot caller, and then Saint left the team, and so now we have no shot caller, and then like we need Chauster to step up, but Chauster's not fully comfortable to step up as the shot caller, and then like I really felt it in this game that we didn't have Chauster. He's our shot caller now. Like we've practiced, we've tried to overcome some of our problems, and we've tried to really adapt to him as being the shot caller, and we get into these games and everybody's the shot caller, and it's chaotic in a sense. Like in those games we had an advantage. We had the game versus Curse yesterday, we had such an advantage. We were in the driver's seat to win, and we misplayed because we were all over the place. We chose to, one person wanted to go in, one person wanted a slow roll, one person wanted a split push, one person wanted to get their last whisper, one person wanted to get their like Negatron cloak, whatever. It puts us all over the place, and yeah, that's one of the things that we realized would be a problem when we came to this event. We kind of wanted to win in every single lane in laning phase and just pick strong lanes and just snowball the game, and that's how we were going to win, because we felt that we just didn't have the team communication without our leader, essentially, that it would kind of like put us in a bad situation.
Another thing that has been something that, at least from what I've seen, it seems like it plagues your team a bit, but it also sounds like something that's endemic to the whole North American scene, is this idea of having like secret strategies that you're going to use on the opponent. So everyone's obsessed with this idea, like, oh, we can't ever scrim someone if they're streaming, or, you know, we have to like keep things quiet, like this is what we're going to do. As though like everyone has some amazing one-off strategy that's going to win the game. But if you actually think of normal sports and even the best teams in League of Legends, you kind of know what they're going to do. You know what their basic strategy is. The problem is you can't stop it, because they have their basic strategy that plays to their strengths and they just execute. I mean, basketball is a great example, because every single team knows exactly the plays the other team's going to run. They've run them all through the season. But if the best teams still win and the worst teams still, even if they try something crazy, it's only going to work every now and then. Well, I've noticed in a lot of post-game interviews, when your team loses and a lot of the North American teams, it's like, oh, well, you see, we had this amazing 2v1 plan for early in the game, but then, it went wrong, like someone else popped out too early or something. So it sounds like even when you have these crazy strategies, because they aren't super well practiced or they aren't like your best plays, they don't not necessarily always pay off, especially if you versus an amazing team. So what's the balance here between like having your go-to playbook that you're sticking with and having the crazy stuff?
So one thing in the past that came up in a lot of North American organizations, specifically me and TSM, was like whether we should stream our scrims or not. And part of the problem was that, you know, we wanted these periods where we could stream secretly, or no, not sorry, that we could just play secretly and practice these strategies and stuff like that. And just, you know, have that ability to find something dynamic and keep it secret. But what actually ended up happening is that we just scrimmed mindlessly, because when you scrim 12 hours a day, or 8 hours a day or 9 hours a day, you don't have a plan for, you know, every hour. You don't have a plan moving forward. So we practiced our fundamentals, our mechanics, and that sort of thing. In that sense, it wouldn't matter if the world saw what we played. It wouldn't matter if you know, everybody was like seeing like what was happening. Now there was a point where there's certain strategies that we didn't want to reveal to the world and that sort of thing, and that gave us a leg up. Like I think we were the best team at creating those strategies. So, for instance, our TP promote strategy, like when that first hit I think when we hit regionals, we brought that out, and it worked, you know, flawlessly. And in that one instance, we got a free win. And had we played it against like a more experienced team like World Elite at the time, I'm pretty sure we just would have won anyway. We practiced that strategy so much in secret that I felt that it gave us so much of an advantage. Now, once it hits the board, it's a totally different ballgame. You know, someone can see everything coming.
So actually, on the topic of practice, I had some ideas about this because my background's in Counter-Strike, and so 5v5 game as well, it's very strategy-based. And so we had actually the same complaints from the North American scene in Counter-Strike that I hear from the League of Legends scene now, and it goes like this, okay? We only have like 2 or 3 other people who are really good to practice. There's no point practicing against the people who are worse than us because we never get any better. And so that's the reason why the Europeans are better than us, because in Counter-Strike the Europeans were the best. That's the reason why they're better, because they have more people to practice against, etc. But then at the same time, I hear the exact same complaints that happened in both games, which is the top North American Counter-Strike team, if they sort of like were having beef with the guys with the third, then they'd be like, oh, we're not practicing with you anymore. And so even their talent pool that they're practicing with, they're sort of cutting down, so not even making the most of that. Well, the interesting thing is, we actually found in Counter-Strike, once the strategies had played out for years and years and years, it was actually a bad thing to practice the same opponents over and over and over again. Because if your mentality to practice was to play like a real game, to try and win the game, then what would happen was, you'd get really good at beating this one opponent, and then you'd find that that approach didn't work against anyone else. It worked against that one opponent, and you'd got amazing at that, but you'd sort of tunnel visioned away from like how to generally play. Whereas if you think of any kind of sport practice, they don't just only play scrimmages, they also have like very specific practice for all your skills, etc. And so the basic question I'm trying to get at is, if this mentality still exists in NA, where like TSM only practice Dignitas or something, then how will the scene ever actually evolve to the period where it can compete with like the Koreans? Because it sounds to me like the way things are right now, people will only play they'll only play to the extent they're pushed. I mean, I heard this interview from Dyrus where he said something like the reason he thought TSM got stomped at the World Finals was because when he played against Frost, Shy was doing things that like he would try things versus Shy that normally he would get away with versus everyone else. And so he'd never been forced to practice, what do I do when that doesn't work? You know, he always could do it. And so that's the scenario I'm sort of getting at here. And so also, if you think, another example is, at that event, Dignitas were complaining afterwards when they lost every map, and they said, oh, you know, we've been practicing TSM all this time before. Well, if you look at the fact that TSM got destroyed at that tournament as well, just practicing that one team probably wasn't the ideal approach. So what I'm trying to tie this into is, like, how does the NA scene get out of this problem? And since I've heard from interview comments, it sounds unlikely that you guys are going to keep going back to Korea for extended periods. What's the solution?
So it's like, the band-aid fix, like the quick fix for like teams, just like individual teams, is to just hop into another region, because I believe we're so behind at the moment that it's like it's hard to keep up pace. It's hard to get back. Now it's not impossible. We've been scrimming pretty dynamically, but sometimes we prefer to scrim like TSM. For instance, in one of these instances, we lost a game in LCS because of our scrimmages versus TSM. TSM played a certain way, and we just crushed them every single time. And we expected, if we can beat TSM like 90% of the time, then we should be able to beat a team that's not as strong as TSM. We believe that we should just crush them. They shouldn't be able to contest us. And so the games happened, and we end up losing, and we're like, what the hell? Like, how did we lose to these guys? We were crushing the better teams in like North America. Like, where does this line, like, where did this come from? And it's partially what you talked about. We kept tunnel visioning on one team and how to play against one team, and it set us back in a sense. And we try to broaden out our scrims and like who we play against so that everyone can get better and we can get better and we can just become a stronger team overall. But it gets into these periods where we play against like teams like FXO and we win like all of our games, and we're half trolling in all of them, and we're still winning 100% of the time. And our opponents aren't just giving us a challenge. So what do you do at that point? Like, it's hard to kind of like, it's hard to progress the scene in that sense. We're always like one step behind. Like, I can go in Korea and we can lose to anybody. It's just so much easier to practice, and it's so much easier to get better. I don't know. It's really hard to explain.
On the topic I mentioned before, where I was talking about like the way strategies are applied and trying to have like the idea of people focusing too much on having like a million weird strategies instead of like say 10 really, really good ones that these are my bread and butter. You can even apply the concept to champions, because I heard an interesting comment when I was talking to Dyrus, where he said that his new focus for playing the top lane is like mastery of like 3 or 4 champions. Because obviously the two poles that people went between, the extremes before, was you saw people before they all got banned, like, I mean, you with Nidalee or Froggen with Anivia, they had 1 or 2 champions they were amazing at, but because everyone knew it, they could ban them out, and that to some degree weakened them. But then sometimes people went the other way, like, oh, well, now I have to learn like 10, so I have 1 I can use in every scenario and pick the perfect one. Whereas instead, there's a degree to which, if you look at some of the best players, they do just have like mastery, like full complete knowledge of like 3 or 4. I mean, a good example would probably be someone like Shy, because so quickly he came to the top of the scene. And if he was only good at 1, that probably wouldn't work, because he'd just ban him straight out and then he'd be fucked. But if he was trying to do 10 at once, it's unlikely he could hang if you were at the top of the frost. Like, what do you think on this topic?
So, mastery, I think, is like really important, and it comes to the point where it's more important than learning a billion champions. So one of the things that my weakness as a player is that I'm extremely good at mastering champions when I get really comfortable with them and that sort of thing. But when something is OP, regardless if you have a bunch of champions mastered, you have to learn the OP champion. Like, there's no going around it. So for instance, when Kha'Zix was OP and I didn't really play kill laners or whatever, I had to play Kha'Zix, and I didn't do that, and it set me behind as a player. It basically, if there was just like a strength ladder of like how strong a player is, just because I didn't learn Kha'Zix, I went down like two slots. And when you get like multiple OP champions thrown into the equation, then you just keep going down and down if you don't learn the OP champion. So you can master a few champions and be really comfortable with that, but whenever an OP comes up, you have to master it. And right now, I'm very fortunate that I can't really think of an OP champion that I don't play other than Elise, and I don't consider her truly OP. So I think I'm in a pretty good spot as a player right now, and I'm quite content of where the meta is, but tomorrow could change. Tomorrow Riot could just randomly buff like a Akali or something, and I would have to learn Akali. So I don't know, that's just where it is right now.
That's actually a topic I'd like to go into, which is basically like the effect that the game being changed itself has on the metagame. Because people, I've noticed there haven't been very much written about this. Like, people haven't broken it down more. They just use this vague term, nebulous term, the metagame, and it can mean so many things to a different person depending on where they are in their career and whatnot. And so the thing I wondered about was, okay, so obviously if Riot changes a specific champion or an ability, that will change the metagame because then people are going to use it differently. But there's that element which takes place slowly when they change the game, but then there's also what teams are choosing to do, because what the majority of the teams do will itself change the metagame, but not necessarily because of those changes. And so to give you a Counter-Strike example from the game before, we would see that the metagame in Counter-Strike went in cycles all the time. And so what would happen was, when a couple of teams who were the best in the world had very, very skill-packed lineups and they played in a very like loose, free way, then because initially they were beating like the very strategical, in-depth, slow teams, everyone would switch to that style. So it wasn't necessarily that that was the best style. Everyone just kind of copied the people who were doing the best, and that's one of the things that was changing the metagame. And then eventually, when they got toppled by the extreme opposite of that, like a tactical team who could destroy a team who were very loose, then everyone switched to that back. I've seen this seems to be happening in League of Legends, because if you look now, what a lot of teams maybe unconsciously seem to do is just look at whoever they think is the best, whichever scene, and start copying them. So when M5 rolls up, everyone's studying, okay, what is M5 doing, what is CLG doing? Now everyone's looking, what are the Koreans doing? And the problem with this is you can get close to them, you can be almost as good, but if that's like their style, they're probably going to be the best at it, and you're always lagging a little bit behind. So to some degree, if you want to actually overtake them, you have to be able to see a little bit ahead, or you have to come up with some strategies that are going to be a little bit ahead of the curve of what everyone's going to do. How does your team actually fare in this prospect? Like, do you think you actually have a talent for this?
So that's actually my philosophy when it comes to champions in general and learning champions in general. That's exactly how I think. Because, for instance, MacNoon plays Jace all the time, right? He used to play Jace all the time. And I had never played Jace once. There is no way I'm going to be better than MacNoon's Jace. So I might as well just try to adapt my own style and my own play, where I can hopefully see beyond that and hopefully see a period in the game where I beat him. You know, I overcome you know, his style. And mirroring people is like okay to a certain degree. Like you should mirror people to sometimes counterpick them. And if I take away Shai's Singe, you know, he's that much weaker of a player. Like that's important too, but also you can't really beat someone at their own game. You know, if they're so well versed at it and so well practiced at it, you kind of need to like shake it up. You need to do something different, and that's actually something we did with TP Promote in the past. You know, we couldn't beat these teams straight up. We couldn't beat a lot of these Korean teams straight up. But when we played with TP Promote, our win ratio was insane. Like, it was to the point where I think if we just played TP Promote in World Finals, that we would have just crushed all the way through, because we were losing a decent margin of our games for CLGU, but when we played TP Promote, we hardly ever lost. It frustrated them to the point where they just got so annoyed with it. And when we played against a lot of other teams, they were just like, ban it. There's no point to play against it. Ban the champions that they're comfortable playing with TP Promote. And I feel that was a way our team adapted, in the sense that we didn't really follow the meta. We kind of like made our own, even though, you know, other people were doing this. But see, the problem is we can't do that now, because we don't have the teams of that caliber to, you know, try it once or twice against. So we can't know if this is going to work for Snodge and Sword, because we can't ever play Notch and Sword. So it's a little bit scary in that regard. Like, we have to copy them. We have to kind of feel out their play style. We have to play it and scrimmage with it in our own region, and everybody has to get to that style, and then we have to, you know, try to adapt. Like, is this going to work there? You know, like, is this strategy going to work like this? It's kind of weird now that we don't have that we're not in Korea anymore and we can't play against these teams.
Since you were in Korea at this period of time where you were there for a whole few months, it wasn't even that you just had to only play the tournament, you had a lot of time to scrim and whatnot. What's interesting was, when I did this interview with Froggen, he told me this like small anecdote that basically one day he'd been actually playing ranked 5 games with Frost. They just like used him instead of Rapid Star, which sounds like a fantasy ideal for people who are like watch streams and stuff like, oh, I wonder what Froggen would be like in Frost. And it made me think of something, which is that I always thought when I looked at interviews, etc., part of the reason why the NA players, like TSM especially, were so late to catch on to the fact that the Asian teams were better than them is because they used to play these players when they were on the NA ladder, okay, these top Asian players before they had their own ladder. And so they would play them just in solo or something. And so they'd see their skills and they'd go, well, I mean, he's really good, but I'm as good, or I'm competitive with him. And so they couldn't see how these players who just individually they might be as good at, as a team were just so much better than them. So I mean, you know that fans now, they tend to just bandwagon whoever's hot. So they wanted to tell you before, oh no, Moscow 5 had the best 5 players at every position, and now they'll tell you the same for like Azubu Frost. Whereas, I mean, with these conversations we've had here, it's quite unlikely they have like the best player at every position, or even like a top 10 at every position, because there's too many good teams, you know. So from your experience of going to Korea, playing these players on the NA ladder, etc., like, is it the case that like the top 3 NA teams are just as skilled as the top 3 Korean teams? Is it just the team play element that's winning them the games, or what do you think of it?
Like, individually, it's really hard to die 1v1. Like, to be honest, like you can still die 1v1, you can still get outplayed, but it's really hard to outplay someone over and over and over and over again. That comes from like team communication, synergy with the jungler. It comes from team play, not really individual play. And I was actually watching your Alex Itch interview, and he's like, you know, this player looks like he's the best player in the world on this team, but if he was to be thrown on another team, he might suck. And that's really true. Like it's how the team gels. Like you can't really expect to win over and over and over and over and over versus all your opponents 1v1. It just doesn't happen that consistently. You can't be that consistent. But what can be consistent, and the biggest factor that wins you games right now, is team play. And like I can't stress that enough. Like everybody wants to like hype players. It's like a fun thing to do, you know, this guy smashed this guy, blah, blah, blah. But just the way the game is turned out right now, it's not really like that. It's really about the team's understanding of the game. It's about the team's communication in the game and just the team's execution in the game. That's the most fundamentally important thing to win a game. All the other factors, they're important in their own regard, but not nearly as important as teamwork.
Okay, for my last question, I want to do a hypothetical, but I want to do one that's a little bit different, because usually if you ask someone who the best player is, there's a quality where they want to like play into the consensus as well of like who everyone else says is the best, etc. And so my way of asking you who the best top laner is, I want to do it slightly differently. Okay, so the imaginary scenario is for some reason the Mafia has taken you, all your family hostage, but they're going to allow like a game of League of Legends to be played for the fate of your lives. So you die if you lose this game. You're not going to play in it, but you're going to pick the top laner who would be on your team to play the other one. So basically, you're picking the guy who you trust with your life. Like this guy, he for sure is going to win this game. He's going to save my life. Who would you pick and why?
I would just go off statistic purely, and I would probably say McNoon. I could care less about the style of play and all these things. Those factors don't really. They don't come into my decision. It's just, I think McNoon has the highest win percentage in his lane, and I would just throw him in there because it's hard to say, you know, like how he would gel with like the rest of the team and that sort of thing. That's when I would need to like break it down and that sort of thing. But if I were just to throw a bunch of players together and I had to pick one from every team or something like that, then I would just pick the highest win percentage from every team.
Okay, do you have any final words, something you want to say, someone you want to thank?
So shout outs to the fans. Thanks for supporting us through, you know, ups and downs as always. Shout outs to our sponsors, Razer, Azubu TV, and XMG, Buff 2. And check out our store at GG Well Played Apparel. And thanks for the interview.